It is the Ultimate Tennessee podcast here on a Wednesday in Nashville, Tennessee. And this is a basketball podcast. Tennessee, South Carolina is done. Kentucky this weekend. We've got your preview of that. Plus, Tennessee adds a very coveted wide receiver in the transfer portal. And we are here to break it all down and a little bit more. We don't have 1980 jokes to make anymore, Lucas, but we still have basketball to talk about. And that is one thing that the Ultimate Georgia podcast, if there was one, would not have at this point. How are we?
That is true. I'm well. Hope you are too. The 1980 jokes, RIP. They are dead and buried. It was fun while it lasted, though, right? 4 solid decades for Tennessee fans, about 2 decades of bragging rights since 1998. So fun while it lasted. Moving on.
It was fun. It was one of the easiest social media trolls for any SEC fans. Now gone. So rip in peace to that, but maybe Georgia will Georgia things again moving forward. We will certainly see here very soon. So Tennessee as a basketball team, for those of you that are in the section of the fan base that decides to relearn around this time every year that Tennessee has a basketball team. The big topic on the show today, we're going to get to this in a minute, is what is a reasonable expectation for Tennessee basketball this year? Has Tennessee already had its biggest win of the season against Arizona? Are they going to top that? I think it's a valid question because Tennessee has been consistently inconsistent this year, and at some point, that's just kind of who they are. But first, Lucas, we're going to start with Tennessee, South Carolina, Tuesday night, 66-46, and I'm going to be totally honest with you. Halftime of this game, I thought we were going towards another overtime game in the 50s, like we were 2 weeks ago against Ole Miss.
Yeah, the difference is the offense kind of woke up a little bit. And look, Tennessee's a much better team than South Carolina. Frank Martin has done a good job just to get that team to 10 wins. An impressive win last weekend at Vanderbilt. Frank Martin, everybody knows how good of a coach that guy is. But a 20-point win in Thompson-Boling Arena where really this game should have been a runaway 30, 35-point type of game. If Tennessee doesn't get off to a slow shooting start, this thing is all but over at halftime. So they do end up taking care of business. And you mentioned being consistently inconsistent. You know, that's certainly true about the offensive end, but that is one thing that you can say. It's not true about the defensive end. This team has been incredibly consistent defensively, one of the most consistent teams in the country. And once again, forcing a team to turn the ball, or forcing a team to have less shots attempted, or less shots made, I should say, than turnovers created.
It's not bad. It's a winning strategy. And look, I mean, Virginia did this as a 1 seed that was the first ever 1 seed to lose to UMBC. And it makes you worry about the fact that can Tennessee win by living and dying from the three when they're not really that good of a 3-point shooting team? It's almost like that's what this season is coming down to if Tennessee doesn't change course, because the inside game just isn't there. And Uroš Plavšić being the backup option has given him a much bigger role. But Lucas, that's a problem for Tennessee right now. If you're going into the meat of the SEC schedule and you really only feel like you have 2 5s that can play meaningful minutes on this team, and John Fulkerson and Uroš Plavšić.
Yeah, no, and the inconsistency from those guys is a big issue, especially a guy like John Fulkerson that you've seen take over games, that you've seen be, at this point, a Tennessee legend, right? He's officially passed Wayne Chisholm in all-time appearances in a Tennessee jersey. He's like 35 years old, still playing college. He's like the new Perry Ellis, right? Remember Perry Ellis at Kansas that you felt like he was in college for 8 years? That's John Fulkerson. But it's kind of troubling that he still has these inconsistencies, and that Rick Barnes still has to send these messages to a guy like John Fulkerson that, Tennessee is not going to get very far if you don't know what you're going to get out of a guy like John Fulkerson, especially for a team that's a little bit thin in contributors down low, which probably shouldn't be the case when you look up and down this roster, but it kind of is the case right now, at least offensively.
It is, I think, pretty apparent to me now that the next player for Tennessee that's going to feel like he was there for 50 years is going to be Zakai Ziegler. This is a dude that maybe isn't a great NBA fit, but Lucas, I have a take now that I've been sitting on that I'm ready to give out to the world. That if you told somebody that didn't watch UT basketball all season that they had a point guard that was a 0-star until June and a point guard that was a 5-star, no disrespect to Kennedy Chandler, they would think that Zakai Ziegler is the 5-star.
Yeah, no, that's fair. He
Okay.
brings a spark that we haven't really seen from Chandler. We've seen flashes from Chandler, but I think Ziegler really sparked this team on both ends of the floor last night. And this team's lucky to have Zakai Ziegler, because if
Yes.
Tennessee doesn't grab Zakai Ziegler in this
Cool.
last recruiting cycle, then it's in trouble. It's in trouble in the
Yeah.
backcourt. So I think you're right. That's certainly a good conversation. That's a guy that could end up having a long career at Tennessee. And Kennedy Chandler still has time to figure it out. You're still just kind of waiting for that game where he pops off and takes over, like Keon Johnson did a year ago at Kentucky, or like Jaden Springer did at times. Of course, with a prospect like that, you could argue Kennedy Chandler is a more impressive prospect coming in than either of those guys, at least more exciting to Tennessee fans. You want to see some more consistency from that spot. So Tennessee's lucky to have Zakai Ziegler. He's just a spark plug out there, man, on both sides of the ball.
He's legitimately the first backup point guard that is a true point guard at Tennessee since Darius Thompson. Like it's not even debatable. Like, it's just true. It's the first time that Tennessee's had a backup point guard. We've had this conversation before in a literal decade.
Yeah, no, that's a blast from the past too. That Tennessee needs more out of Kennedy Chandler. I'm willing to say, and he's getting the minutes right. Like, Rick Barnes trusts Kennedy Chandler, and that's not an easy thing for Rick Barnes when it comes to point guards. We all know the sort of contentious relationships he's had with guards. Not that it's a bad thing, but just what it takes to play point guard under Rick Barnes. You could ask Jordan Bone about it. You can go back and ask Kevin Punter about it. But he trusts him. He got 25 minutes out there last night, and Kennedy Chandler ends up going 2 for 7 from the floor. He gets them 8 points, 5 rebounds and 3 or so assists. So he trusts him. So I think Rick Barnes believes something is going to come out of that. But once again, it was Ziegler having the bigger impact with 11 points and 4 assists, and even throw in 4 steals in the mix.
Yeah, and his first half kind of gave Tennessee oxygen that they did not have. 7 points in the first half of those 11 for Ziegler, who was 3 for 4 from the field in the first 20 minutes of basketball. Lucas, without the Josiah James, 26-footer at the buzzer at halftime, I'm not sure Tennessee wins this thing by 20, because they ended up really putting the pressure on South Carolina after the first media timeout, where South Carolina could have easily been down 3 points at halftime. Josiah Jordan James, out of a double team against Kennedy Chandler, gets the ball, makes a crazy shot. He's making 1 in 20 times to give Tennessee really an undeserved 6-point lead at halftime. And it just kind of changed the whole environment in Thompson-Boling Arena. It changed the entire halftime conversation, I imagine, for both teams, because out of the break with 14:39 left, it was a 14-point Tennessee lead. And at that point, the game is over. South Carolina is not scoring enough points against this Tennessee defense to erase a 14-point deficit in about 14 minutes of basketball. It just seemed like maybe that could be a moment where this thing just kind of clicks. I kind of want this to lead us into our main conversation on the show today, because we felt like we had these moments with this team last year, right? The way Jaden Springer and Keon Johnson played in Lexington, in taking over a game. We thought, okay, there it is. There's the John Fulkerson we remember. There's 2 freshmen just saying this team is ours now. And then what happened? They get knocked out in the first round of the NCAA tournament, doing the exact same things that they did in bad losses to bad teams against Ole Miss, against Georgia through the entire season last year. When is this team's identity just being inconsistent? Because we're going on 2 years now where this team just can't play consistent offense. And John Fulkerson doesn't look like the first team SEC player who put this team on his back in 2020 for another win in Rupp Arena in Lexington.
Yeah, and that'll be interesting coming up on Saturday. Well, they'll be back in Rupp Arena to play Lexington. But yeah, that's what they are until they're not, right? I mean, that is what they are, because that's what they've put out there until they don't. And that's been the case for the last, really, since Grant Williams, Admiral Schofield, Jordan Bone, since that whole crew. That has been the case for Tennessee basketball. Inconsistent, especially on the offensive end. So that's a fair way to put it. It's what they are until they're not. And unfortunately, I feel like Josiah Jordan James kind of embodies that a little bit. He's such a confusing aspect of this team. There's no question how important he is to this team. And he's never going to be the guy to score 20 points per game. But, he's 2 for 4 from the 3-point line, and his 2 misses are completely wide open, uncontested shots. And his 2 makes are with a hand basically, right in his face, basically covering up his eyes, especially that last buzzer beater before the half. He's just kind of a hard guy to figure out, but he's hugely important to this team. A double-double last night, but you got to get that consistently from him. And I don't think it's fair to, call him or anybody else on this team a head case, but it does feel like that's the stem of the issue sometimes, right? Is the confidence. And that's worrisome to me. The confidence should kind of be on the same line graph throughout the entire season. And it feels like it's just up and down and all over the place. And I think that's a problem for a team that, with the talent and depth that it has, should have very high expectations.
They're just the offensive aspect of this team is offensive. I mean, there's no Grant to just throw it down to in the low block and say, all right, everybody clear out, go get some points. I mean, Rick Barnes has a losing record in the SEC when Grant Williams is not on his team. Like, that is a conversation that we can now have because there's a big enough of a sample size without Grant Williams for Rick Barnes than there was with Grant Williams for Rick Barnes. And it kind of goes back to a conversation we had in the offseason and a conversation I've had with Ron Slade too, of Rick Barnes can still reach the ceiling that Tennessee wants him to reach. I still think Rick Barnes can take Tennessee to a Final Four. I just think there might be only one way he can do it. There might be only one strategy, and that's have a Grant Williams. Have a four that is just elite, that you can play inside-out basketball with, who is cerebral enough to get the guards involved, to get everybody lined up, a point forward on the floor, who is now flourishing and shooting three-pointers in the NBA. That would have helped, obviously, at Tennessee too. But aside from that, I don't know how else this Tennessee team can win with Rick Barnes, because I don't know if I trust him to get the most out of elite guards that are only there for a year or two. And if you don't have those guys, you're not beating Alabama and Kentucky and whoever else steps up consistently in the SEC.
Yeah, it's just because we haven't seen it yet.
Right.
We haven't seen it yet this season. And until we do, I'm very much a believe it when I see it kind of guy when it comes to sports. So until we see it, I'm not buying into it quite yet. I know the pieces are there. They have everything they need. It's just not coming into fruition. And it's not just those guys, it's the role players too, right? I mean, we've talked about Justin Powell on this show a lot, complaints about him not being on the floor in critical moments where you need a three. Well, that wasn't the issue on Tuesday night. He was on the floor 19 minutes. That's the fifth most minutes of anybody on this roster that night. The most minutes of anybody off the bench and no shot attempts.
Yeah. And no
19 minutes and no shot. I mean, he's basically just running around out there.
Yeah.
What is Justin Powell doing for 19 minutes on the floor without putting up a three-pointer? I think that in and of itself spells out a lot of the offensive issues within this team.
I think you're right. And I think the question you got to have about another highly touted newcomer on the bench and Brandon Huntley-Hatfield is, when does that guy decide to just go ahead and enter the transfer portal? I mean, I know this is a guy that reclassified to play for Tennessee this year and should still be a high school senior. But Lucas, that's a valid excuse when you've got a scrawny, long forward that maybe doesn't look the part. If there's one thing we can definitively say about Brandon Huntley-Hatfield, that guy absolutely looks the part and is big and physical enough to compete and be a force in the SEC right now.
Yeah, they need more out of Huntley-Hatfield. He hasn't gotten the opportunities, and I wonder what the reason behind that is. He only had a couple, 2 minutes against South Carolina. We did see a little bit. We saw some flashes from good John Fulkerson in that game with the 10 points and the 7 rebounds and a couple of those, high-pointed releases that we've sort of come to know with Fulke over the years. But Hatfield, throw him in there with Kennedy Chandler. You just want to see more. You just want to see more because those guys are the reason that Tennessee fans were so excited for this season. And this isn't like a case of a Kentucky under John Calipari, who always takes, X amount of games, 10, 15 games before they really figure anything out and start to pick up some steam. This isn't like that at all, because this isn't a hodgepodge group of 4- and 5-star freshmen and sophomores. This is a very well-balanced group of vets like John Fulkerson, Josiah Jordan-James, Santiago Vescovi, and the 4- and 5-star younger guys like Kennedy Chandler and Brandon Huntley-Hatfield. This team feels like the perfect blend for success in March, and we haven't seen it yet. So these next 5 games are going to be so massive, I think, in determining sort of the trajectory of this team for this season, because it starts on Saturday, a noon tip-off, noon Central in Lexington against Kentucky. You go to Vanderbilt the following Tuesday. You're back home to host 12th-ranked LSU, try to get back the loss in Baton Rouge from a week ago. And then you've got Florida at home, and then you've got Texas on the road in the SEC Big 12 Challenge. Those 5 games are going to be hugely important to really be a measuring stick for this team, because we've seen the ups and downs. We've seen, you're right, that Arizona win might end up being the best win this team has all year. They're going to have another opportunity at that, probably against Auburn. But as we've seen from how Tennessee's matched up with Bruce Pearl coached Auburn teams, that hasn't gone so well in the past. So these next 5 games are so critical to continue to pile up good wins and gain some confidence, because again, as much as I hate to say it, feels like this team just desperately needs confidence, and that doesn't bode very well the closer you get to March.
Rick Barnes said on Monday, we're going to make shots. I believe that. I really do. But even if not, we will continue to get better defensively, and it may be ugly, but we'll have a chance to win. What is a reasonable expectation for this Tennessee team this year, knowing that, knowing that Rick Barnes has at least a little bit of confidence he'll put on the record about this team and their ability to shoot the basketball? Because at the end of the day, defense does travel. Every play-by-play and color guy on SEC Network and ESPN who broadcasts for this team always says this. It's like Josh Dobbs being an aerospace engineering major. Well, defense, it does travel, and Tennessee is one of the best defensive teams in college basketball, and that's absolutely true. But I worry about the expectations for this team, because we've seen defense travel and we've still seen them lose in Madison Square Garden, in the NCAA tournament last year, in the SEC tournament last year. So I'll pose the question to you first before I give my answer on this. What is a reasonable expectation for this team?
Well, from what we've seen so far, I think a reasonable expectation is sort of in that Sweet 16 range if they're able to get hot at the right time. But from what we've seen as far as their consistency, I think that's kind of the ceiling at the moment. That doesn't mean that that's the ceiling end all be all for this season, but just from what we've seen, and defense travels. I mean, they have no business winning that Ole Miss game, right? When they put out complete duds offensively, they can pull games out on defense. I mean, the Ole Miss game's a perfect example, and they're a shot away from beating Texas Tech after a horrendous offensive performance. By the way, a Texas Tech team that just knocked off undefeated and top-ranked Baylor on Tuesday night. That was a great game, but that only goes so far. I don't know if you caught any of the Iron Bowl on the hardwood, Will, between Auburn and Alabama.
Most of it.
But high-flying, high 70s, low 80s type of game.
Like a different sport. I understand
Auburn and Bama, a different sport. And I understand they're not top-notch defensive teams in the SEC, but at some point, when teams get hot like Auburn and Alabama and they're flying around in transition, I mean, the speed on those two teams alone and the way that they're able to hit shots from outside when those shots are falling, I don't know if it really matters that much how good you are defensively, because at some point you have to score. You have to score consistently, and you just have to outscore people. Nobody's going to win the national championship winning games 45-43. At some point, you have to be able to win a game 81-77 like Auburn did at Alabama on Tuesday night. And I don't know that this team's capable of doing that, save for one game against Arizona, which was impressive, but we just haven't seen it in any type of stretch this season.
Well, and the difference too, and I completely agree with everything you said, by the way, the problem is that you don't have the Thompson Bowling Arena crowd to travel with you to the SEC tournament, which is in Tampa, by the way, this year. So there goes any home court advantage that Tennessee has had here in Nashville right there. You can't rattle an elite team like Arizona in Boise, Idaho in the first round of the NCAA tournament, or in the Sweet 16 in St. Louis. You're not going to have 90%, 95% of the crowd like you were able to do in a first half where Arizona was completely rattled against Tennessee. If that game is played on a neutral site, Arizona wins by 8 to 10 points. And at this point, I don't trust Tennessee enough to win ugly against good basketball teams away from Thompson Bowling Arena, right? They should have beaten Alabama if they have John Fulkerson and Kennedy Chandler. They should have beaten Texas Tech if their best three-point shooter just makes an open shot at the buzzer. But we're talking more about these games that they should have won versus the ones that they did. Even Alabama last year in the SEC tournament. They should have won if, John Fulkerson doesn't get clocked and is able to play in that game, and they probably beat Alabama in that game. Yeah, probably right. But that's the common denominator, Lucas. The common denominator is not, wow, they found a way to overcome X, Y, and Z. At some point, their identity is just the fact that they can't get over the hump away from Thompson Bowling Arena against really good teams. And I just think that's the identity of this program right now. And of this team. I think a lot of Tennessee basketball fans or just Tennessee fans in general forget how bad things were before Bruce Pearl. So I'm not one that is wanting to get rid of Rick Barnes and is wanting to discount what he has done, because the guy has resurrected this program from probation times 2 with Bruce Pearl and with Donnie Tyndall, and he should be commended for everything that he has done. I just think, Lucas, that not only has this team already had its biggest win this year, I just think the biggest win of the Rick Barnes era might have already happened at this point, and we're talking about sustaining this thing, and this thing just kind of humming along without disaster. I think that's not the worst thing for Tennessee right now. I just don't think they're going to get over the hump against a Nate Oates, Bruce Pearl, or anyone else kind of team away from TBA.
Yeah, I mean, I think both things can be true. You can say that the stability that Rick Barnes has put into Tennessee, and obviously players want to play for him. I mean, the recruiting, the way that that's improved over the last few years has been fantastic. And at the same time, you can say that based on the results on the floor, that there does seem to be a ceiling on how far this team can get. And we know that based on, I mean, how many years are we in the Rick Barnes era now? Is this year 7, year 6?
Started when I was a freshman, so that would have been 2015.
Mm-hmm. So year 6, right? So year 6 or 7 of Rick Barnes, I don't know. Let's not do math. But a Sweet 16 being your best product, year 7. A Sweet 16 being your best product in the NCAA tournament, and a couple of runner-up finishes in the SEC tournament. That's what we have from a pretty decent sample size, 7 years in this league. And again, there's stability there. Players want to come play for Rick Barnes. And we've seen it in flashes this year. We saw this team put up 89 points on a neutral floor against North Carolina.
Yep.
Not the best North Carolina team. It's the first in the, first in the post, oh gosh.
Roy Williams.
The Roy Williams era. Yep. Blanket on that. I was about to say Dean Smith. That dude's been dead for how many? But 89 points against North Carolina on a neutral floor. You have the high 70s, point win against Arizona, a team that's still in the top 10. And then you nearly knock off Alabama on the road, like you said, without your 2 best players. So, the bones are there, but I think these next 5 games, we're really going to find out what this team's made of, assuming that they can stay healthy and kind of stay together as a unit.
The reasonable expectation for me, I got 2 of them. I think I'm going to agree with you. Sweet 16 should be the expectation for this team, regardless of the flaws that they have and the issues they've had this year. But I think as far as the SEC schedule goes, get the double bye. Be one of the top 4 teams of the SEC in the regular season. You're 2-2 at this point. You've already played maybe your second toughest game of the year at LSU, considering how crazy that environment is. And how good that LSU team is. The hardest is going to be Auburn at home still, but you've probably still got a lot of your hardest games ahead of you. Top 4 in the SEC is reasonable, considering how talented this team is. You've got Auburn, you've got Alabama, LSU, Tennessee, Kentucky. Those are your top 5 teams of the SEC. You can absolutely be in that top 4. I think Tennessee's better than Alabama. I think if they had a chance to show it in Thompson-Boling Arena, they'd win that game. But we will see kind of what comes back around in that matchup if it does in the SEC tournament. But I think this team should be one of the top 4 in the SEC, even with the flaws that they have, just because they are still so good defensively.
Yeah, I mean, this team should be on paper competing for a regular season SEC championship.
No doubt.
We'll see what happens. I mean, the SEC, it really is top to bottom. I think it's the best we've seen it in a very long time. And it feels like we're starting to say that every year. Right. But I think it's true because Arkansas, scrappy. Vanderbilt, with Scottie Pippen Jr., they've got some nice wins this year. Alabama is still going to be high flying. They have some of the most exciting talent. I don't know if you saw that dunk by J.D. Davison the other night against Auburn. I mean, that game by itself was some of the most entertaining basketball I've seen all season. And Texas A&M's kind of flying under the radar here.
Yeah, they're not bad.
I mean, here's a team with double-digit wins, a well-coached team by Buzz Williams. Remember, made a ton of noise at Virginia Tech before he got that job. He's kind of flown under the radar after kind of a slow start at A&M. So don't rule out the Aggies. There's a lot of work to be done in the SEC. So Kentucky, Vanderbilt, LSU, Florida coming up with these next 4 in conference. I think we're going to learn a lot.
And they're going to lose one they're not supposed to an Arkansas, to Georgia, to Vanderbilt, even coming up in a week, a team that really wants to get over the hump against them. So going to be interesting to see kind of how this team evolves moving forward. Lucas, real quick, before we switch to our final topic here, the sad thing about Alabama-Auburn, the final 4:06 of that game, 12 points were scored. You know how many of those were free throws?
How many?
10. In the last 4 minutes of that game, There was
Yeah,
one field goal.
I guess I was just feeling the high from how electric
Oh.
that game was for the first.
Well, the game was great. The atmosphere was incredible, but as a neutral fan, I just don't watch college basketball anymore. I just can't. Like there is no other sport where referees take over and just make it a free throw, make it a shadow of what the sport actually is than basketball. And that's saying something, because the forward progress call in the Purdue game was pretty bad.
Well, yes. And speaking of that, though, that's something we hadn't even brought up as far as the free throw shooting. That's been a real problem for this team.
Terrible.
They were 44% from the line against South Carolina. They're the third worst team in the SEC right now from the free throw line. I mean, that's been a big problem. And, Santiago Vescovi's been pretty steady in that area. But when a guy like Kennedy Chandler goes to the line, you need him to knock down both shots. When a veteran like John Fulkerson, I understand he's a big forward, you need him to knock down those shots. And, at least at a 60-70% rate. Tennessee right now is shooting under 65% from the free throw line, or excuse me, under 67% from the line as a team. They're only ahead of South Carolina and Texas A&M in the SEC. That, we saw it come back. They beat Alabama if they shoot better from the free throw line. They blow South Carolina off the floor if they're better from the free throw line. They don't need overtime against Ole Miss if they're better from the free throw line. So hopefully that doesn't kind of rear its head a few more times this season.
You're right. It is like peak John Calipari Memphis level bad free throw shooting, which is, anytime I compare anything to Memphis, that's never a good thing. So certainly not great. All right. What is great for Tennessee? They just got a really good receiver. And I think this is a guy that Tennessee fans should be really excited about. Isaiah Nair, coming over from Wyoming, announces about 2 weeks ago now that he is committed to Tennessee. 4-star prospect, the number 22 player in the transfer portal. I can't believe that we're saying things like that. And the number 4 transfer wide receiver. The 878 yards are good, but Lucas, the 12 touchdowns that season last year as a redshirt sophomore, very strong for Tennessee.
Yeah, I mean, here's a guy who averages over 30 yards per catch in his career at Wyoming. And to me, I looked at it as sliding right into that Javonte Payton role.
Yep.
Right. A guy that's there it is. There's your deep threat when you need a 70+ yard touchdown, like we saw so many times with Payton. So big get to be opposite of Cedric Tillman. And if Tennessee can get a breakout year out of Jalen Hyatt, then this team will be pretty set at the wide receiver core. So I think there's your big play threat right there. Big 6'3" receiver, can win 50-50 balls, speed on the outside. This is a big get for Tennessee for a guy who was getting recruited by some big-time Power 5 schools, by the likes of Texas and other schools. He's from Texas, so the Longhorns were pushing to bring him back home. But it's kind of an example of how attractive this offense is going to be to certain positions, and that certainly paid off with this portal addition here.
The big question I have left for Tennessee at the wide receiver position is who plays the slot primarily. Of course, you got Jimmy Holiday, a guy who we've seen pretty good speed and athleticism from on kick returns. You've got Walker Merrill out of Brentwood High School, who kind of came on early and then maybe hit a freshman wall in the middle of the season. He is definitely a Hunter Renfrow slot kind of receiver right there in the middle of the field. And then you got Jalen Hyatt, who can play the slot position as well, a guy that's not quite as physical and big on the outside, who is probably more suited for slot. That way he's against a smaller, quicker corner that maybe isn't as big, that can't knock him off of his routes. You got a lot of options there. But that is, I think, the only question I have left now for Tennessee at the wide receiver position.
Yeah, I mean, Ramel Keaton comes back. There's another guy that feels like he's been there for forever, former 4-star prospect that just hasn't quite broken through and become a steady contributor. He hasn't been done any favors by stability as far as the coaching staff since he's been there, but it'll be interesting to see what Cody Burns can do with Ramel Keaton this offseason. Jimmy Callaway, another guy in the mix. So this receiver core is deep. They're going to feel like they have a very steady top 3, some big play threats in Tillman and Nair. And if Jalen Hyatt can break through this season in the way that we all thought he would last season. Yeah. I mean, Hyatt was on the cover of the Athlon Sports preseason, college football magazine. And he kind of fell short of that. He certainly did. So if he can kind of come through, had a touchdown in the Music City Bowl, then Tennessee's going to have one of the best 3-headed monsters in the SEC maybe in the country at wide receiver. But what can Josh Heupel do with it, right? I said on this podcast weeks ago, the honeymoon continued, right? The honeymoon has continued through this recruiting class. Certainly a controversial finish to the Music City Bowl. You hate to end your season that way, but the honeymoon is still very much happening with Josh Heupel. But now is where it gets tough. Now you're returning. Hendon Hooker is going to be on some Heisman boards coming back, and Cedric Tillman, arguably the best returning receiver in the SEC, certainly in the SEC East, as far as production goes. So now is where it gets tough for Josh Heupel, because it's no longer, you got to a bowl game and then 7 wins, round of applause, coach of the year. That happens in 2022. Then the grumbles start to come in.
And that Pittsburgh game, I'm just going to go ahead and call this now. There will be Tennessee fans that will be out on Josh Heupel if Tennessee loses to Pittsburgh again. Like, it's just, that's not even a hot take at this point. It's just true, because we know Tennessee fans very well that that is going to be your first big measuring stick of tracking your progress against a parallel program's progress the year before. And no, the ACC champion is not parallel to probably the 6th or 7th best team in the SEC. I get that. But losing Kenny Pickett and then having to start over with Keaton Slovis, that kind of makes Pittsburgh, a parallel to Tennessee. So, I mean, I'm just going to go ahead and call it now that the pitchforks will be sharpened by some if they don't even dominate Pittsburgh. Like, they can win that game close. I still think fans will be like, nah, can't beat the big one. It's just going to happen.
Well, they could dominate Pittsburgh and then turn around and lose to a Billy Napier coached Florida team in Neyland Stadium, and the pitchforks will be out. So then the pressure's on right out the gate. Like, the first 3-4 games of the season, pressure's on for Josh Heupel to go up, win in Pittsburgh, and then beat Florida. Tennessee has to beat Florida.
They do
in 2022.
That's the real one. That it's not the first measuring stick. So it's not where my brain immediately went. But if Tennessee loses to Florida, then who cares if they beat Pittsburgh by 100? Like, people are going to call into our station and want somebody else hired.
Correct.
I can't wait.
Interesting.
It's horrifying, but I can't wait. Hey, make sure you subscribe to the podcast, the Ultimate Tennessee Podcast. I appreciate you guys hanging out with us all of 2021. And we are coming up on 100 episodes here, Lucas.
Wow.
It's fast approaching. We're in the 80s right now. But let's go ahead and get the juices flowing, the gears turning of what we might do for a 100th episode. I don't know. We'll
get in the lab. We'll figure it out.
We don't have the technology. Who's to say? Who knows what goes on in the Tigers Den? All right, hit the subscribe button. Give us a review. If you think it's a 1-star show, keep it to yourself. If you think it's a 5-star show, let us know wherever you download podcasts. We'll be back at it again next Wednesday to recap a busy week for Tennessee on the hardwood. For Lucas Panzica, I'm Will Bolin. Thanks for listening, and talk to you next time on the Zone Podcast Network.